Hi there. I'm Tom Field, Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you back to our latest installment in the Cybersecurity Leadership Series. This is where we bring the C-suite together to talk about the cybersecurity issues that really are impacting our present and our future. Our topic today is going to be fraud, the increased risk amid an unprecedented lockdown. I know we're getting sick of the word unprecedented, but it's, in this case, it's applicable. Some background here for our discussion today. COVID-19 has created unprecedented opportunities for crooks and thieves, honestly, to seize advantage of the human condition and to up the ante on internet criminal activities. Modern hackers are very familiar with social engineering techniques and the behavior of crowds. Attacking the cognitive system has become an art form and has sprung new branches into areas such as healthcare, consumer sentiment, in addition to banking and payments fraud. So today, we want to explore the various subtopics within the larger umbrella of internet fraud. And to do so, we have assembled here an array of talented cybersecurity professionals, leaders with which to conduct that exploration. I'm going to introduce you to the panel here right now. Joining me here today to discuss fraud, let's begin with our CEO, Vijay Balasubramaniyan. He is the CEO of Pindrop and founder. Vijay, thanks so much. We've got Nicolas Severino, the COO of Buguroo. From the CISO suite, please welcome Anne-Marie Zettlemoyer, Vice President, Security Engineering with Mastercard. Olivera Zatezalo, CSO with Huawei Canada. And finally, Nastassja Finnegan, CSO of First National Bank in South Africa. Folks, thank you so much for joining me today. Our first topic is going to be synthetic ID. So some background here. Synthetic identity is a type of fraud where synthetic identities are created using either a blend of real and fake or wholly fake personally identifiable information, which then is used to open an illegitimate bank account. It's the fastest growing type of financial crime in the US, according to the Federal Reserve. And my question, and Vijay, I'd love to turn this one to you first and have others weigh in on it. Since these techniques are specifically designed to circumvent security checks and adding more intrusive checks to an already complicated onboarding process can seem like a bad idea because of the friction it can add, what do you have as an alternate solution to detect and prevent synthetic identities?
Synthetic identity, ultimately, a lot of these attackers need to figure out what identities to go create. And what we're finding is that, with the new age where you have the ability to use deep fakes to create images and audios and videos, you now have a whole suite of new arsenal for these attackers to start creating these synthetic identities. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen completely fake identities where you have fundamentally an image of a person who doesn't look like anyone else, but this person is actually created by a deepfake image creator. And so when you're looking at these new kinds of techniques, adding intrusive ways to determine that identity is not real is absolutely not the right way to go. Again, you have to use technology, and there's a lot of technology being developed to detect when these synthetic identities, don't follow the normal rhythm, right? And the way to think about normal rhythm is the fact that you see a lot of customers are starting to use customers' behavior. What are the patterns of people over a vast majority of data? So actually using the data that you have to determine what is real, and then to use that as a baseline to determine when a new identity created has previous history similar to your existing customer base, and when it starts moving away from that previous history, to start using that as flags to determine synthetic identity. So the alternative solution that a lot of organizations are marching towards is one, behavior, and two, history, massive amounts of data history to be able to tackle many of these new attacks that are making synthetic identities far easier to create.
And you hit the nail on the head when you talk about deep fakes and how today there's a lot of opportunities and tools that attackers can use to try to fake how do you look and what do you look like. What they cannot fake, and Vijay talked a little bit about the history, right, of what you've done in the past and the information that we have at our disposal to try to piece together that person that you are versus the person they want you to believe they are. The second point they cannot really fake is, who you are today. And in our case, one of the things that we've seen get a lot of traction and we've seen getting a whole lot of progress and effectivity when you take a look at resolving this problem without transferring the weight of the solution neither back to the user or into the financial institution, because that's part of the problem. It's not about distributing the responsibility of the solution, but rather implementing something that's going to help you solve this. It's about behavioral. It's about understanding when the person, that individual, is behaving as an individual and not as a fraudster and not as an automated or a fake machine. So there's some very simple things that we can do in order to detect fraudster behavior by leveraging behavioral biometrics. Things like, are you too familiar with the form? Are you too quick to put a postal code or you have to search it up? Are you going in an automated fashion? For example, moving the mouse in a very firm, and you automatically go from this point to that point instead of flowing there. So there are multiple type of things that we can do in order to leverage that behavioral biometrics as a secondary, more effective way of resolving the synthetic identity issue.
Looking at some of the behavioral-based or synthetic biometric included behavioral-based biometrics would actually be really well suited to working towards this progress. But I also think that there's an element of education that is still absolutely needed, because that's a technology that is either in process of being implemented, developed, designed, or is future state. There's a now problem that still needs to be resolved for. And that now problem comes down to not just the technology implementation, but a resource and process and training complementation that's needed as part of this.
The deep fakes and impersonation and all of these, even really sophisticated spear phishing attacks, these are they take effort. And it means there's going to be a persistent, sophisticated attacker that's giving interest to these types of exploits or, targets. And I think that while appropriate for some uses, many organizations still need to focus on the basics. This type of, obviously in the payments industry, and when we're talking about national security or critical infrastructure or industries like financial services, are going to be more interested in this type of thing faster and earlier. But for the majority of companies, I really feel like, Tosh has hit it on the head, where there are fundamentals that still need to be addressed, still need to be hardened, still need to be brought up to par before we, spend too much energy on something like that yet for the majority of industries.
So it goes back to the people, process, and technology. I think in this case, technology can play a big role, and technology can help, especially AI, artificial intelligence, to understand the user's behavior and to see what is expected and what is unexpected. So I think technology, this is one of the scenarios where technology can play a big part.
I want to talk about new account fraud. Now, we know that new account fraud is a growing problem, especially since the lockdown and the increase in online banking activities, online digital activities, period. Crime rings, such as one in New Jersey, which was recently busted by the FBI, are known to have been running 7,000 synthetic identities simultaneously. They created 25,000 credit cards and stole more than $200 million. So the question I have, Nicolas, I'd love to have you answer this one first, because you were talking about behavioral biometrics. Yes, we've seen advancements in behavioral biometrics, but is that technology going to be enough to stop this burgeoning crime wave by itself?
So, Tom, look, behavioral biometrics is a huge step forward and will allow you to take control and detect and stop most of the attacks. Now, we've seen this trend and we've seen the problems around new account fraud, which by definitions is a fraud that occurred in the first 90 days of the account being created. And what we saw is that link analysis and understanding how things are being perpetrated, it's probably the perfect complement and the solution that allows you to not only extend the reach of the detection process that you can do with behavior biometrics, but in our case with Fraudster Hunter, we can do things like understanding if there was a confirmed fraud that occurred from a device. Usually fraudsters will use the same device to commit or try to commit multiple frauds. So that way you can understand, okay, from which device was this fraud committed, and then try to, by doing link analysis, figure out, okay, which other frauds were potentially trying to be performed from this very same device. And we actually have a couple of success cases when customers in the first days of implementing this ability to do link analysis were able to stop on its tracks hundreds, if not thousands of attacks that were trying to be perpetrated. So it's looking at the behavior, is looking at the information, the session, the device, and taking a step forward, not only to do the actual detection, but also to fine tune for future behavioral metrics and adjusting the models.
We talk a lot about online. One of the places that we play in is in voice. So, this is when, fraudsters are trying to actually attack your call center channels, right? So when they're actually social engineering your agent to try and do their bidding. But the really massive spike that we've seen, especially due to COVID, is one, we've seen a crazy spike in self-service. That is, when you call in and you do press 1 to speak in English or press 2 to speak in Spanish, that IVR system, we're seeing a massive spike in fraudsters using that IVR system to start gleaning things about accounts. And towards that end, when you see fraudsters essentially create bot armies that are dialing phone numbers one after the other, just to see, a simple thing is, if I dial all the top 10 banks with a particular phone number and I go through each phone number, if I actually have an account at one of these banks, because my phone number is the right phone number, a lot of these banks will actually say, hey, welcome, Tom, your account balance is so much. So that going from just having a phone number, or even I don't even have a phone number, I just go through all the possible phone number combinations, add an IVR, which is another machine. So when machines are talking to machines, you have even more fraud. So these bots are actually down all of these different banks and trying to create a map of which people bank with which banks, accounts with which insurances, have done a retail transaction with which retailers. And so they're starting to build a picture of you, Tom, and then they're using that to do all kinds of crazy things, right? Open up new accounts, create synthetic identities. And this is where, to Nicolas's point, using behavioral characteristics where you're starting to see that, hey, when this person is entering his social security number, the speed at which he's entering his social security number is too quick, right? It's following a certain cadence that a human can never repeat, right? A human can't press every digit quite after the other. But having said that, fraudsters then quickly learn that if you're looking for patterns like that, they're going to space their behavior as well. But how do you handle those new grammars is then the next set of attacks that we're going to see, and we have to counter those attacks. So behavior is really, really important. Another one that was important is combined wisdom of crowds. What we found our organizations, the organizations that we deal with, is as soon as they find a synthetic ID or a new account that's perpetrating fraud, they're starting to become really good at passing that information on to other organizations. So to the point that Nicolas made, if you see a particular device, or you see a particular voice, or you see a particular behavior at a particular organization, one thing is to find that it repeats in that organization so you can catch it. But an even more powerful mechanism is if that behavior or voice or device repeats itself across anyone in a combined consortium of customers, you can then catch that person. So not only do you shut him down at bank A, you get to shut him down at insurance B and retailer C, and that's super powerful.
So one of the things I think companies probably don't spend a lot of time on, or not enough time on, is the value of protecting reconnaissance. So what you said in the beginning, where you have threat actors gleaning information, watching, not necessarily doing anything malicious yet, but trying to learn from the system, I think does have an extraordinary amount of value. And I think that there is opportunity there in the industry to put more protections at place before we start verifying, before we start allowing pieces of information out there that in itself might seem very benign, but collectively can be easily weaponized. I mean, in fact, we're training the threat actors there, right? And I can't tell you in previous lives how many conversations I've had, even with industry folks or different clients that I've had about this thing. And we've got to educate a little bit better about what can be done with that information, and really, how can we provide solutions that allow for that type of information protected, but that's not going to impede the customer too much. Remember, there's always this trade-off on what is going to be cumbersome for the consumer. So do we want them to go through 900 steps before we tell them what their account balance is? No, because nobody's going to use it. So how do we get smarter and have risk-based discussions and risk-based decisions?
I always love hearing about, new processes and everything that's coming down the line, but we're still stuck in a today world, right? And there's still an element of today's operations, today's challenges we have to face. Consumer education, consumer awareness is critical. I mean, most of our clientele aren't ready to hear about, bot to bot attacking fraudulent accounts. I think it's an overwhelming. It's also finding that difference between FUD and education to help prevent fraud, and there's still a lot of basics that need to get done today, and it's about protecting how it's done and making it usable for the consumer.
So this is a scenario where we can use a combination of the technology and process change. So definitely technology can help a lot. We can use technology to understand and analyze the request to create a new user account or a new card, and go through few layers of defense. At the end, if the request really looks suspicious, I think the simple process change, just make sure you get in touch with that person who is requesting a new credit card or new account, and verify it's really him using a 2-factor or 3-factor authentication. It would really help. So I think in this particular scenario, combination of technology and simple process change would work best, depending on the situation. I know that in a banking industry, probably we don't want to be asking people to call the users and confirm. It's expensive, it's time consuming. But I think that in this case, when they're really requesting a creation of a new account, it's the only way to be confident it's really coming from them.
As security, in my mind, is always about a risk equation. So I think having that verification step is really important. And I think consumers are getting to the point where they sort of expect it. If you're going online shopping and you're just looking and they ask you to do a 2-step there, then why wouldn't we have that at a financial transaction as well?
I'm going to switch gears here and talk a bit about smishing. So smishing, or SMS phishing, is the social engineering attack that targets mobile phones. It works by sending messages attempting to trick the victim into giving out confidential information that the bad guys then use to take over their accounts. A recent set of Bank of Ireland attacks netted almost $1 million stolen from 300 different account holders. So the question I have, and Olivera, I'd love for you to tackle this one first. What do you find to be the most effective ways to prevent these impersonation-based frauds, and why aren't banks, any organization, embracing these solutions more?
I think we have to train our consumers, and not just consumers, train our older family members to recognize the suspicious even email or SMS message. And we have to give them some techniques and mechanisms how to recognize and how to validate. So I think in this case, we can just go so far as the financial institution providing the services, but at the end, I think it comes to the user security awareness training and user education. So like we have to give them some simple tips, even when they're opening a bank account, like how to recognize when the bank is calling, or never to return the call, never to return the SMS, but always call the bank to check, to confirm that this request is really coming from the bank. So I think that would be my answer. It's a security awareness training.
So now we see this enhancement, for example, with telecom flagging spam, flagging suspicious phone numbers. And I think that can be a next step as well.
You have to combine that with controls as well, right? Because one of the smishing attacks, which I talked about, people mining the IVR to get your account balance. So when you get an SMS text which says, hey, we found fraud on your account and your account balance is $13,648.57, and it's exactly your account balance, it's kind of hard to avoid responding to that, right? Especially when the attacker has gone through the process of doing the reconnaissance, figuring out so many details about your account, and then sending you an SMS text with a 1-800 number to call, and you're actually calling the wrong 1-800 number. And then, he's patching you on to the regular customer. Even there, the fraudster is trying to be a man in the middle to find out all your information or to take over your account. But in those cases, reconnaissance plays a really, really important part in them creating SMS messages that are real. And so having technology that allows you to detect these reconnaissance and protect you against that is part of the equation, right? Like part of it is consumer awareness, but part of it is also organizations protecting you against that. And I get the sense, and I get the fact that, we don't want to be, we have to do some basic things, but these attacks are here. These are happening. So no matter how much we don't want to get overwhelmed by these attacks are here. And we can either, put our head in the sand and say, oh my God, I'm getting overwhelmed by all of these attacks, or we go address them, like you said, looking at reconnaissance, because organizations don't spend enough time protecting against reconnaissance.
A lot has been said about detecting and protecting. When I think about TASH, it's also a whole lot about responding, right? So not only is how can I detect this, and again, behavior biometrics can play a big role in this, to make sure that account takeover action is being detected and stopped, but it's also making sure that the user is protected even when they don't know they're being protected, is giving the financial institution the ability to, when the user is directed to a phishing website, for example, by means of a smishing attack, they can automatically be redirected to the real website, even they don't know. But then someone like Tash gets the feedback and has the ability to immediately respond, and then going back to the previous question, do some link analysis and figure out, okay, if this came from this actor that from this device launched this attack, what is it that we can do? What else can we do? So try to bring it full circle and add another layer, which is not only about detecting and protecting, but also responding.
I mean, some of these things, or a lot of these things, will not be prevented. You want to get in, you're going to get in. You want to take it over, it's going to happen, right? There is going to be a level of sophistication that just cannot be overcome. So that means that you have to have systems on the recovery side as well. If, a consumer is, sadly taken advantage of, how do we make him or her whole? How do we make them whole? That's got to be part of the equation. It's not just that upfront reconnaissance, which I said was a part, not the whole thing. It's not just, all of these other technology pieces to it. The whole spectrum requires recovery and wholeness at the end as well. How do we get you back to whole?
I think the only thing I would maybe add and come back to Anna Marie around the recovery and making it whole is things that we as the financial services could do differently to work towards that and be consistent in our messaging, or our messaging platform as an example. So, if this is the new digital age, how do we communicate with our customers on our platform as opposed to multiple platforms like email for statements or SMS, or, if we have a single consistent platform for communication and communicate and educate, continuously educate our customers that we will only speak to you on this platform. It's the same way there was a trend around entering username and password. There was a mass education from financial services. We will never contact you and ask you to enter your username and password. I think, that, like Anna Marie mentions, there's somebody's going to fall for it all the time, but we know that our fraud stats, decreased with that continuous education to our customers. The same process will have to follow in this wave. If we're consistent about the way we communicate and we keep talking to our customers in that specific fashion, we teach them not to fall for phishing and phishing scams via other channels as well.
I think it's more of our behaviors in what we would ask, not necessarily how we would ask it, because you have to be able to reach everybody by the methods they have available to them. So in the vein of inclusivity and making sure that you're getting to everybody where they're at, not everybody has different methods of communication, but certainly educating, even internally. We do this with our own employees, right? Our own organizations. The CEO is never going to ask you to transfer $1 million, right? The IRS is never going to call and ask you to give them money over the phone, So I think the messaging from your point, the consumer behavior and consumer education about what we will and will not do, I think is really key too.
Anne-Marie, I want to switch topics here. I've got a topic I want to actually start with you. It's about psycho hacks. So Anne-Marie, we saw just recently the results of a teenager who spearheaded an attack to execute a Twitter hack of 139 accounts. These included those of people such as Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. In just a few hours, he pulled in over $100,000 from naive account holders. So my question for you, we're tribal, we're empathic by nature, we're overly susceptible to these social engineering hacks because we want to be helpful. What are we doing now to make progress, to spot these and respond to them appropriately, as opposed to give in to our instincts, really?
I have not heard the term psycho hacks. I don't like it. Let me just say that. I don't think that's a great term. I'm not going to use it. But I think in the case of the Twitter issue that you mentioned, passwords, it was easy to overcome. They were targeted attacks. So first, let's talk about why was it easy for this individual to take over the account? Did they not have multi-factor? Did they not have protections against that? And I would say that it was not a sophisticated attack, really, so it was too easy to overcome. And then I think your second question is that we're weaponizing compassion. We see threat actors weaponizing compassion, right? And that's not new. It's an emotional response. They'll weaponize compassion. They'll weaponize fear. They'll weaponize any type of emotional response, whether that's, hey, I'm a Nigerian prince with $100 million and I need, so we know that emotional response is going to be invoked. Why? Because it's easy to get people to do things that way. you know? So do I want to change that behavior of humans to be compassionate towards each other, to trust? No, I want to make it easier for people to be confident in that trust. I don't want you to question whether or not you're doing something good, something noble. I want to give you the confidence that you can do that and know that you're making a good choice.
The assumption usually from not the perspective of the individual, right? So Anne-Marie touched on how can we make sure that we don't harden people, but provide them a vehicle for them to do what they do best and do it confidently. The question becomes, when you're on the other side, when you're at the financial institution, how do you deal with this? And the assumption is usually, whether it's using social engineering or by virtue of weak passwords or whatever the entrance door was, credentials will be compromised at one point. And when you start from that assumption that the credential will be compromised, you don't put the burden in the individual on your customer. You don't, the customer experience does not suffer. But at the same time, you put in place technology and processes and procedures that will allow you to respond to that. Again, I go back to behavioral biometrics, and even when my credentials were compromised, even if my own device was compromised, we can infer that it's not you, it's not Nico, the person that is putting those credentials from that device, and that will allow to create an additional layer of protection to try to fend off this type of attacks.
I want to close on a topic that we all have got interest in, and the topic is insider fraud. So in the virtual workplace, we have employees now who are working remotely. They're under conditions of pandemic fatigue, personal stress, maybe even financial stress. And we've lost some of the checks and balances of being able to physically monitor these employees. So my question, and Tasha, I'd love to start this with you and have each of you weigh in on this one before we wrap up here. At a time when employees might be more inclined to commit fraud or more inclined to make a mistake that can lead to fraud, what can we do to reduce our insider risk? Because everything we knew about insider risk really has changed. So Tasha, I'd love for you to start us out.
I think it's a tough one to trigger right now because it again talks to, did we not have insider fraud when there was other world stresses taking place? I think COVID has forced us into a digital world, but there were still other business stresses, economy crashes, corrupt governments, protests worldwide. I think the same emotional and stressful pressures existed. It's just transitioned into digital. I think financially, obviously, there's been additional pressures. It's around making sure that your internal processes are properly working and in place, and about making sure that your employee health checks and assessments are probably done more now than ever before. But now it's important to look at things more so around the double I principle, and access controls really becomes a critical component here. But I don't think that our landscape has changed from an insider sitting at home versus an insider. All of us had to address the exact same controls we could for everybody working from home as what they do in a building. I think it is a financial pressure additionally, but I think we're under the same conditions we were pre-lockdown. It's still insider fraud is still a massive issue we have to address.
So from my perspective, there are two different areas to look into. So one is logging and monitoring. I think it's very important to log and monitor all critical activities that employees do that it can make a significant impact or damage to the organization. And Security Operations Center can play a role with that, in that. So we can actually work with the management. We can document what users or employees are supposed to do during the working hours. We can define acceptable behavior, and we can actually trigger an alarm in a Security Operations Center if they do something that they're not supposed to do, or if they try to get an access to the application they're not supposed to have, and stuff like that. So I think definitely Security Operations Center, we can monitor this in real time, and logging and monitoring identify all critical applications that we actually have to monitor and log the activity on this application. And also important, another area that we usually overlook is the role of HR. So very often, hackers would target a specific organization and try to get a job at that organization in order to do some internal hacking. So I think HR has to play the role when we are hiring these people up front to do a due diligence in a background check, in security check. So for these critical roles, we have to identify which of these roles needs security screening, a security clearance. When is it okay just for the HR to interview? When do we need to ask for a police check record? Or when do we need to ask for a government security clearance? So I think these are two areas that I will start.
You had a lot of call center agents who had to badge in and be physically present in a particular location before COVID, and now it's become all remote. And so, maybe there is certain amount of logging and monitoring, but the things that you're looking for when people are physically present in a location and when you can, ensure rules like they can't use their mobile phones, you have mechanisms to do cell phone jamming and things like that, those no longer hold when you're in the comfort of your house. And we've seen situations where, agents are actually giving the rest of their family access to the actual login and passwords and things like that. And they're not the ones doing the job. They're actually forking off the job to other people. And in one situation, they're actually forking off the job to someone not even in the household. So I think it comes back to not only now in this COVID world, what are the kinds of events you're looking for, but also starting to get really clear newly in authentication to make sure it's the right agent. So we have now customers making sure that the agent that's speaking on the other end is actually the real agent, right? By virtue of his voice, and it's not someone else. And then they're doing things like things that Tash mentioned in terms of authorization and access control. They're putting more emphasis on the fact that when you don't have a supervisor who can see why you actually accessing a particular account that you have no business accessing, you now have systems that are put in place that make sure the kinds of access that you're doing. So you're getting a call on a particular account. That's the only account you should be able to pull account. But those systems were never in place until COVID happened. You could access any account at any point in time because there were other checks and balances in place. So, a little bit of this is what is practically possible to now what needs to be possible in this COVID reality.
Particularly with call center agents, but really I've seen this type of fraud happens pretty much everywhere in every genre. I mean, I remember, let's not talk about how long ago this was, but a few decades ago when I was in automotive, I remember folks that would, come in and somehow have 3 different full-time jobs and would have 3 different full-time salaries, right? And it was because they had other people subbing in from them. And that's not entirely widespread, right? But it does happen. And, we caught it because we noticed there were several payroll distributions into one account out of different pay centers, right? So, those protections aren't new. They've happened for a while. We seem to talk about them in security like they've not happened, like they're not in, they're not already employed in financial accounting systems, but they may not be, those principles may need to be extended more, right? So that they carry over into other scenarios.
The way we started noticing that this was actually happening was when we started looking at a month worth of calls. We started seeing that there were a couple of agents that had a higher percentage of fraud going to them. More fraud calls, like imagine, right? Like in a month, if 25% of fraud calls are all happening with one particular agent, either it's a retraining requirement or it is something malicious is happening. In this particular case, something malicious was really happening. But, the notion that, you said, right, like you started seeing these activities, these distributions that were unlikely, again, using the data actually points to the fact that you need to improve your controls.
every call center agent should be on one call at a time. And, it's one of those things where, again, when we design a system, unless you have, and here's a great point, I think, if we're wrapping up to end on, very recently, we were talking about a new product, new feature, and they had security at the table, and we started to talk about how things could go wrong or how things could be used in unintended ways. Why would someone want to perform that reconnaissance? What could they use with the data? What could happen? And the engineering team said, that's why we need you here, because none of us would have thought like that, because that's not the perspective that, we live every day. And so I think, to your point, Vijay, when you saw, those anomalies, that popped into my mind immediately, because I've experienced that myself. And if you have enough perspectives in the room, you're going to get a better system. You're going to get a more secure system, and hopefully an easier to use system.
Rethinking what it means insider fraud, it's probably at the heart. I think that there's no such thing as insider in the way we thought it in the pre-COVID world. We can talk about measures and systems and technologies that you can use, but in the end, it's about getting those different perspectives Anne-Marie was talking about, making sure that you have not one but multiple layers, protecting not only the task at hand, but also the process that's been executed from wherever it is, whether it's inside, outside, or a combination of both.
Well, very good, panelists. I want to thank you each for your time today. I appreciate your insights and what you shared. We've covered a lot here over the course of the conversation, so thank you very much. Phishing, insider fraud, there's so much to talk about and so much more we'll cover in future events. Again, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you so much for watching us today.